Well, uh, good morning, everyone. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is a different form of my morning musings, which I normally film and upload to YouTube, and then I put here on Facebook. But I have all of my equipment at my office, which is a good ways in town. And here in southern Oklahoma, right here around Ardmore, we have about as bad an ice storm as we've had in many, many years. We have a tremendous amount of just absolute black ice. I mean, it is about as treacherous as I have seen. I would drive in, but my wife asked me not to do that. So anyway, this is my very first time ever to try to use the live video. Now, I see a few people have joined. That's great. So evidently I am live. I appreciate you joining me. And so I don't know how long this is going to be. I'm not even sure if once I get this done, if it will stay there on Facebook, or when I hit end broadcast, if it will just simply disappear. All right. All right. And by the way, since we're doing this, I welcome your comments down here. I mean, I just saw that people can write comments. So I will do a little bit of a presentation on what I want to. This will be more of an introduction to what I presented in my video time before last. And that is the significance of the relationship to suffering, martyrdom, and resurrection. Now, if you go back in the series on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you will find that I did examine this for a while. Thank you, Carrie, for letting me know that. I did not realize that. And thank you, Anna. I appreciate that. So, but I want to drive this home because what we're doing is examining the relationship between Romans 5 to 8 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Virtually all scholars agree that Romans 8 especially is a discussion of the resurrection. And they focus generally on Romans 8:18 and following, where Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. That glory to be revealed is generally understood as the resurrection. So once again, we have Romans chapter 8 and we have 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul talks about suffering in Romans chapter 8, leading to that. But notice what he says in Romans 8:17. If we are heirs together with him. If so be that we suffer with him, we shall also be glorified with him. So here is Paul tying sonship, suffering, and glorification. Now, the first thing I want us to point out here that is so critically important is that when Paul says, if we suffer with him, and that is from a Greek word, sun pathemata, or it's a verbal form actually, and it literally means suffer with Christ. In Paul's theology, as the first century church was being persecuted for their faith in Jesus Christ, they were suffering with Christ. Notice what Paul said in Colossians 1:24. Paul said, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and I fill up in my flesh that which is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. Now, this verse has caused commentators incredible difficulty. Paul, are you saying that Jesus did not suffer himself enough? No, that's not what Paul is saying. But Paul is saying that there was a reciprocal amount of suffering. Christ suffered his suffering. The church, the body of Christ, likewise had to fill up a measure of suffering. Why is that? It is because, as Jesus talked in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus castigated the Jews as he stood in the temple. And he said, which of the prophets have you not slain? And he said, you bear witness that you are the sons of those who persecuted the prophets. You adorn the sepulchres of the prophets. And you say, well, had we been alive in the days of our fathers, we would not have slain the prophets. But he said, by doing that, you bear witness that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets. And he said this amazing thing. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. And he said, behold, I send to you wise men, scribes, and prophets and apostles. Now that's conflating Matthew 23 with Luke 11:49. Same context, same statement. And he said, some of them you will crucify, you will scourge, you will chase from city to city. Now listen to me very carefully and please catch the power of this. That upon you may come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all of these things will come upon this generation. But notice this issue that Jesus raised. Jesus said, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Well, what did their fathers do? The fathers killed the prophets. And he said, I am going to send my prophets to you. You're going to kill them, persecute them, chase from city to city, that upon you may come all of the righteous blood all the way back to Abel, which, by the way, I've just got to make this comment. It is very often said that the destruction of Jerusalem was a strictly local event. And after all, who cared about the destruction of a troublesome Jewish city sitting in the middle of absolutely nowhere? Well, the problem with that view is the same argument could be made about the crucifixion and the death of Jesus. Who cared about the death of a rabble-rousing Jew, for crying out loud, in the midst of a city sitting in the middle of nowhere? What made the crucifixion of Jesus so important? Well, it's because of who he was. It's because of what he was doing. Similarly, the fall of Jerusalem, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, the destruction of Jerusalem was the vindication of all the martyrs all the way back to creation. Now, let me ask you a question. Were there any Jews in the days of Adam and Eve, of Abel? No. And so the judgment that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 23 is a comprehensive judgment. And by the way, I know this is a bit of digression, but it gets to where we're going. That judgment on Jerusalem, in which all of the blood of all of the righteous shed on the earth all the way back to Abel, would likewise be the judgment of the living. Upon you will come, and the dead, all of the blood of all the righteous. So this is the comprehensive judgment of the living and the dead. Back to the issue at stake. And do I have a timer here? Yeah, I'm already at 10 minutes. Okay. Notice that Jesus said, fill up the measure. I want to introduce something to you, and I developed this extensively in my book, Who is This Babylon? And Anna, you're exactly right. Jerusalem was Old Covenant Babylon. In my book, Who is This Babylon? I discuss and develop the idea that God had 3 cups, actually 4, but We'll focus on three. God had three cups. Number one, there was the cup of sin on the part of the enemies of God. The cup of sin was full of the sin of the enemies of God who persecuted the saints of God. And they filled up their cup because they sinned so heinously in their abominations against the heart, against the mind, against the will of God. And so, in metaphoric language, God said they filled up the measure of their sin. Well, again, filling up the measure of their sin was done by persecuting the saints. The suffering of the saints had a measure, a cup, that was being filled up by the amount of suffering. That's what Jesus is alluding to. That is, the cup of evil is what Jesus was alluding to when he said to the Jews, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Revelation chapter 17, 6 and following. Babylon the harlot had a golden cup full of the blood of the martyrs of God and of the saints of Jesus Christ. But notice this in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 10, as Peter, writing to the diaspora who were being persecuted for their faith, said that they needed to rejoice in that suffering because their suffering and the suffering of their brethren throughout the world was being, quote, completed. That word completed is the Greek word epiteleo. And guess what? Filling up the cup. Revelation chapter 6, 9 to 11. John says, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out, holy and true, how long, O Lord, holy and true, do you not avenge us on those who dwell upon the earth? And they were given white robes and told to rest, how long? 2,000, 3,000 years? No, for a little while. Now watch this. Until their fellow brethren and the saints who would be slain just as they were should be completed, should be finished, filling the cup of suffering. That's why Paul could say, I fill up in my body that which is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. And notice this. I got to hurry here. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 9 and 10, I reckon that God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all, as men condemned to die. Now, I'll pick up on this imagery in our next video on this subject. But could Paul possibly say, could he possibly say that the apostles were the last people, the last men to die for the cause of Christ? Well, that's ridiculous. If generic suffering, if generic martyrdom was the focus, then Paul was obviously wrong. But Paul wasn't focused on generic Christian martyrdom. He was talking about the same context of Matthew 23, the same context of Colossians chapter 1, 24, pardon me, the same context of Revelation 6, the same context of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. The suffering of the saints that had to be filled up. And when the suffering of the wicked when the suffering of the wicked was full, when the suffering of the righteous was full, God's third cup, which was his cup of wrath, would be poured out. And in the pouring out of wrath, you find the judgment of the wicked, and you have the glorification of the righteous. And thus Paul said, if you are heirs, we are heirs together with him. If so be that we suffer with him, we shall also be glorified with him. I discuss all of this extensively in my book, Who is This Babylon? Don't even have a copy of it here, you know. But go to my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. Do yourself a favor, order the book, Who is This Babylon? And if you order the book, make mention of it, send me a note, and I'll refund your shipping. That'll save you $5. Okay. Well, hey, you know what? I've gone on for 13 minutes here, and I do hope this worked. Everyone tells me it's working. I thank you so much for all of you who have joined in here. I appreciate it so very, very much. And boy, I got to tell you, folks, I'm really, really proud of Don Preston. I figured this technology out. I'm normally so technologically challenged that it's really painful. So thanks again. Hope everyone has an absolutely fantastic day. God bless. Lord willing, we'll see you back on Monday, unless I decide to do something else today. Who knows?